And this evening, we are going to examine, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to examine the great red wines of France. This evening, we're going to look at Rhone Valley and, excuse me, the Rhone Valley and Bordeaux. And then next week, we will focus exclusively on the red wines of Burgundy. And I do apologize to those of you who are, and I know that's probably 99% of you, who are expert and you understand the whole concept of the French classification system, the AOC, Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée. But for maybe the one or two of you who don't, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I would like to quickly go over it now. Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, or AOC, how it's referred to, really means the awkward English translation is the control of the name of the origin. Basically, it means it's a certification, a control of where the wine actually comes from. So to put it in very crude terms, imagine that that Florida was a wine producing region. Therefore, any wine that was grown and bottled in Florida would be able to put on the label Appellation Florida Contrôlée, because, and it didn't matter whether the wine was good or bad or red or white or whatever, it was grown and bottled in Florida, and therefore you could have that appellation. However, we all agree that South Florida, for example, produces better wines and has a higher reputation and therefore a higher cost. And for that reason, the more people coming in, I don't know if you can all hear the admit all. Admit all. Sorry about that. Hope I'm going to move all these latecomers down to the front of the the church to embarrass them. So imagine in South Florida, where the wines are supposedly better, then to have an Appellation South Florida Contrôlée, for example, it might define that you must have a certain type of grape, for example, a Cabernet Sauvignon. So to put Appellation South Florida Contrôlée on the label of your bottle, it must be a specific grape, Cabernet Sauvignon. But within South Florida, there are different regions, I mean, different cities. There's Hialeah, there's Miami Beach, there's Coral Gables. And obviously, we all understand that Coral Gables is the most exclusive and therefore the best of all these possibilities. So in order to put on your label Appellation Coral Gables Contrôlée, not only must it have been grown in Coral Gables and bottled there, but also, as we have established for South Florida, it must be a Cabernet Sauvignon. But beyond that, for example, it must be a minimum of 14% alcohol, or there is a limitation on you can only make 1,000 bottles per hectare. So in other words, as the reputation of a wine goes up, as the price of the wine correspondingly goes up, so the limitations on the Appellation Contrôlée increase, and they're more and more defined. I just wanted that to be established. So the French really invented this whole system, the AOC, Appellation Contrôlée system, but we're finding pretty much the same thing in Italy and Spain and Portugal. Anyway, now I think we've got how many people have we, doesn't show me, very frustrating, but I don't think anyone's in the waiting room. So let's go ahead and do the most important thing, which is pouring the wine. It's a Chateauneuf de Pape that we're having this evening. As I have suggested in the previous two classes, we're going to talk about the meaning of this particular wine, where it's grown, what's special about it later. But for the moment, it's simply a red wine. So, oh, and one of you did send a question earlier this evening, wanting to know about my fancy Baccarat glass, my daughter. Does this really improve the taste of the wine? Probably not. The important thing is that your wine glass, however humble, as long as it's wider here and narrower here, that serves the purpose of a good wine glass. This is very attractive, and therefore that increases the pleasure. And of course, it reminds me that I have a daughter who thinks I'm worth a $70 wine glass, which makes me feel very, very good. So, I was a little worried. This is a Chateauneuf, well, we'll talk about the details of it later, but I was a little worried that the tannins would be high, but it is very, very smooth. There's a beautiful fruitiness to it. So in a little bit, we'll talk about, for a start, it's going to mature over within the next hour. And we'll talk about where it comes from later. The other thing that I wanted to mention was the cheese that I recommended that you have with it, Brillat Safran. I mean, you just put it in your mouth and it evaporates, pure pleasure. And I was delighted to pick that cheese. It's very appropriate for the Chateauneuf de Pape. But the other reason behind it is it's named after a famous 18th century writer of whom I'm very fond. He wrote Les Études of Taste. He was a writer. He lived in the Ancien Regime and then survived through the Revolution. And he was a lawyer, he was a writer, he was a philosopher. But he was really probably the first person who talked about taste. And I'm just going to read from my favorite book, of course, a quotation from his 1825 book, The Psychology of Taste. Your Honor, an old marquise once asked from the end of the table, one end of the table to the other, which do you prefer, a wine from Bordeaux or from Burgundy? Madame, the magistrate, he was a judge, and Brillat Savarin was a judge. The magistrate who was thus questioned answered in a druidic tone, that is a trial in which I so thoroughly enjoy weighing the evidence that I always put off my verdict until the following week. In other words, he would continue to drink Bordeaux and then Burgundy to see which he preferred. He also is another of his great quotes, which I love. He wrote, Burgundy makes you think of silly things. Bordeaux makes you talk of them. And Champagne makes you do them. That's Brillat Savarin, after which this delightful cheese is named. And who have we got in the waiting room? I don't think we have anyone. This is good. As I mentioned in my email, I'm going to stop halfway through this evening so that there will be a possibility if any of you want to. I'm going to unmute you. God knows what's going to happen then. And then we will have a live question. What I'm doing now, I'm going to launch the PowerPoint and we'll see what that does to our presentation. So unfortunately, though I can see your delightful faces for the moment, you're all going to vanish the moment I do this. Oh, and the other thing I meant to mention is that I had intended to have French wines this evening, but our president has unfortunately put a verdict against French wines, and so we have to have an alternative. So just kidding. I hope you can see me because I can't see me anymore. So I'm going to have to continue with this. hoping that you can see me. I'm doing it blind. Okay, I was just kidding. We really do have French wines on the menu. We're going to, over the next 2 weeks, look at the 3 regions. Today it's the Rhone Valley and then Bordeaux, and next week we're going to do Burgundy. Next week with Burgundy, as you can see, there's only one grape. There's only one grape permitted. We'll discuss why that is next week. That's the Pinot Noir. When we go down the Rhone Valley, which is where we're going to start, the 3 major grapes for the red wines are Grenache, Syrah, and Mourvèdre. And that's referred to as a GSM for obvious reasons. And in California, they've started specializing in that combination of wines, and they call them GSM wines. In Bordeaux, for the past 600 or 800 years, it's called, the English call it claret. There are 6 permitted grapes to make, to have an Appellation Bordeaux Contrôlé label. That's Cabernet Sauvignon for the tannins, Cabernet Franc for the, what was Cabernet Franc for? It was for the color. Merlot for the fruitiness. No, Cabernet Franc was for the earthiness. Merlot was for the fruitiness. Malbec for the dark color. Carmenère for the aromas. And Petit Verdot was for the structure of the wine and its body. So these 3 different areas have 3 different sorts of grapes. And as I discussed, I think in the first class, the difference between terroir and varietal. Over the 3,000 years that we've been making wine in Europe, we've decided that this particular area will be good for this, and this particular area be good for that. The Rhone Valley, start off there. And I know that this evening is, I promised the great reds, but we're going to have a quick look at the white wines of the Viognier of Condorot in the Rhone Valley, the big famous red of the northern Rhone is Hermitage, and then we have Gigondas, Lirac, and of course Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which hopefully we're all enjoying. I was worried, it's a 2018. I thought it might be too young to drink, but this is very soft, and it's got a delightful fruitiness to it. And the final one is Costière de Nîmes. So here at the Rhone Valley, but when we talk about the Rhone Valley, it's that area of France below Lyon. Above Lyon, then you're in Burgundy, which we'll be discussing next week. South of Lyon, you have the Rhone Valley, and it's divided into the north and the south, bit elementary, I'm afraid. But there is a reason for that. The northern Rhone Valley is much narrower. You've got the Massif Central, you've got the foothills of the Alps, and therefore the valley itself is narrower. And there are very strict limitations on the wine, on the varietals, the grapes that you can grow there. Basically, for the white, it's Viognier. It's always a hard one to pronounce that. I did practice earlier this afternoon. Viognier. Viognier. You don't pronounce the G. And for the red wines, it's Syrah. And Syrah, which we'll talk about in just a moment, is exactly the same as the famous Australian grape, Shiraz. Once you move into the southern part of the Rhone Valley, it widens out. And not only does it physically widen out, which changes the whole nature of what's going on down there, but the southern Rhone Valley has been invaded by just about everyone. So you've got traces of the Phoenicians and the Greeks and the Romans and even the Arabs for a while controlled it. So you've got every sort of, for example, when we come down to Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which we're drinking this evening, there are 18 different official different grape varietals that are permitted. So completely different from the north, where it's just basically 2. And this is interesting, I found. Next week, when we come to Burgundy, we'll see that the white grapes, the white wine is only allowed to be made from Chardonnay, and the red wine is only allowed to be made from Pinot Noir. We'll discuss why next week. Burgundy is obviously, because it's further north, is cooler than where we are now in the northern Rhone. And because the temperature change, the pairing there is Syrah or Shiraz for the red wine and Viognier for the white wine. I just find that, you know, you couldn't, and maybe with climate change, which is a big problem for the wine growers in Burgundy, as the temperatures get hotter and therefore move north, maybe in 20, 50 years, when we go to Burgundy, it'll be Syrah and Viognier, which are being grown rather than Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. But I speculate. So let's just finish with the white wines. As I said, the grape is Viognier, and the biggest AOC, Appellation Contrôlée area, is Condrieu. And those are, so you can see, and I've stuck in, normally I don't like talking about prices, but I put in the prices just to give you an idea of their respective value, if you like. So Condrieu is the biggest AOC for white wines from the northern Rhone Valley. I've mentioned Chateaubriand, which is much smaller. What's important, what's interesting about Chateaubriand is it's a monopole. I'm going to talk much more next week about monopoles, but basically a monopole is when one person or one family owns the whole AOC. They own it all. There's only, so within, in Chateaubriand, the family, I think you can see there, their name is Nuret-Gachet. They've owned it for hundreds of years, but fell upon hard times, and they've sold it to a man called Francis Hinault, who probably one of the wealthiest men in France. He owns Boucheron. He made his money in timber, but then he's bought up Boucheron, he's bought up Hermès, he's bought up Yves Saint Laurent. So he got all the perfumes and all the handbags, ladies' handbags. By the way, there's an excellent exhibit on ladies' handbags at the Coral Gables Museum, which opened just a couple of days ago. I do encourage you to go and visit it. But then he started collecting, not collecting wine, not like that. No, he collects vineyards. So he bought Chateau Latour, and then he discovered monopoles. So he started collecting monopoles, and next week we'll see some of the other ones he's got in Burgundy. The thing about monopoles is, yes, one person owns the whole AOC. Could be addictive if you have enough money. So that's the white wines of northern Rhone Valley. On the map, you can see I've mentioned the Charvet family. The Charvet family were originally growing Viognier in 1292 in the northern part here, you can see on the map. Then in 1481, they moved to Hermitage. In English, I guess we would call it Hermitage, but the French call it with a silent H, Hermitage. And the Charvet family, they have on their labels, Vigneron, Père et Fils depuis 1491. In other words, growing wine, father and son, since 1481. That's 16 generations. They've just, the same family have been growing wine in Hermitage. Now, let me tell you about Hermitage, the origin of it. Now this is a legend. We don't have definite proof, but it's a lovely story anyway. In 1224, Gaspard de Sterburg, a knight of the Holy Roman Empire, came back from the Crusades, and he was so upset by what he had seen, the cruelty, the horror, the bloodshed, that he just wanted to retire. So he sold off most of his possessions, but he came back from Persia, from Shiraz in Persia, which I've actually visited in the 20th century, and it was still growing wine. This is before things changed dramatically in the Middle East. But back then, Shiraz was famous for its wine. He brought his vines and planted them around his hermitage, his cave on the top of this little hill. And they're growing there still. And that is and the wine is Syrah. In the 19th century, another Englishman went and took some of those vines, took them out to Australia, and because of the legend of where these had originally come from, he called it Shiraz. And of course, the Shiraz, the Australians have made Shiraz so immensely successful. Even actually some French growers now in the Rhone Valley label their wine as Shiraz to get into the English and American market. But I find it amazing that this particular family been there 539 years making Hermitage. And Hermitage is a delicious wine. As you will see in a moment, it's quite expensive. Louis XIII made it the official court wine of the French court in Paris. Louis XIV sent 200 casks of it to Charles II in England. And during the 19th century, before the revolution, the Tsars of Russia, that was their favorite red wine. The favorite white wine was Chateau d'Yquem, but their favorite red wine was Hermitage. And I've highlighted those two dates, 1889 and 1990 and 1989. Those were fabulous vintages in Europe, and you'll see some of the most expensive. I mean, look at the prices here. The $539 bottle, that's for the white wine, which isn't really that famous, but the red wine Hermitage for 1990, it's $7,500. What I really love on this is just one of those wine searches that you do on Google, is down here the 2015 at $999.99, and there's a 10% discount. I just think that was irresistible. And the other thing I should mention is you'll notice that in the middle there, it's spelt with an Hermitage without the H. That's simply because the French don't pronounce the H when they're saying Hermitage. So sometimes it's spelt with the H and sometimes without, but they're both the same. So that was the northern Rhone. We're now moving into the southern Rhone. And the main wines down here, the main red wines, are Girondas, Lirac, Costières de Nîmes, and Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which we are hopefully all enjoying. The GSM, Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre. We'll see in a moment the full list of all the grapes which are permitted in the southern Rhone Valley, but those are the dominant ones. And as I said, in California, in Southern California, particularly around Paso Robles, they're really specializing in growing what they call the GSM. There's a nice story behind the Costières de Nîmes. In 74 BC, after the Egyptian campaign, Julius Caesar was so pleased and so successful with his, with conquering, getting Cleopatra and solving all that messy business with Antony, that when he came back, he gave his soldiers as a reward vineyards in this southern part of the Rhone, and it's called Costières de Nîmes. And even today, the logo that they all use is, as you can see, a crocodile with a palm tree. That's in memory of the Egyptian campaign and the generous reward that the soldiers were given. The other two wines I mentioned, the Gigondas is a splendid wine, and I've occasionally managed to find it in Trader Joe's for sort of at the $20, $25 level. But it does tend to be, this is a Robert Parker 95 points, and therefore it's up there at $90. Lirac, very fruity, very delightful. The other thing I should mention is the bottles, same as this. Again, Unfortunately, I can't see myself on the camera. It's vanished somehow. This is a Bordeaux bottle, and you see the high shoulders, and we'll be looking at those in just a moment. Whereas all the wines that we're looking at otherwise in the Rhone Valley or next week in Burgundy have these sloping shoulders. And now let's come to Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And how are we doing on time? I could get really carried away here with this particular story. Philip IV of France was probably one of the greediest and most evil rulers that, well, just one of them in Europe. He was obsessed with making money, and he had a really naughty friend. They used to do all the sort of naughty things that naughty wealthy men can do, and his name was Raymond de Gotta. So when Philip inherited the throne, he made his mate Raymond Archbishop of Bordeaux. That was in 1297, and Raymond immediately planted a vineyard, which is still there, and it's just on its 700th harvest. Actually, more than that, 720th harvest is going on right at the moment. But Philip was always in need of money, so he thought, well, who's got the money around here? The Jews, the Catholic Church, and the Knights Templars. So he killed, expelled the Jews from the country, but took all their money. He then, the Pope in Rome, Boniface VIII, was a pretty unpleasant person himself. He made the mistake of traveling through France. So Philip had him kidnapped, and he didn't want to kill him because, you know, killing the Pope is... But he put him down in a deep dungeon, and whatever happened to him was so horrible that the man, Boniface VIII, beat his head against the wall. Dante, by the way, puts him in the 8th circle of hell, which is where you're kept under pitch, boiling pitch, and every time you try and get out, there's devils up there prodding you with forks. So he definitely got his ending. Raymond, the Archbishop of Bordeaux, Philip made him Pope in the place of Boniface. So, but he didn't go to Rome to be Pope, which is where popes usually are. He built a new place in Avignon, and Châteauneuf-du-Pape means the Pope's new home. So Raymond built his castle, which is still there, Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and planted new vineyards. I mean, he was really, really into wine. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And then, so he got rid of the Jews and the Catholic Church. The last thing was the Knight Templars, who were actually, it was the most wealthy organization at the time in Europe. And Philip had them all arrested on various charges, mainly sodomy, and took all their money and all their property, and then tortured the leaders. And the main leader was Jacques de Molay, who'd been tortured, repented, and he was in front of Notre Dame de Paris on a pyre, about to be burnt, when he issued a curse, and he cursed the Pope and he cursed the King, and then he went up in flames. Within a month, and this is all well documented, within a month, Pope Clement, by the way, Raymond de Gotta, when he became Pope, changed his name as Pope to Pope Clement. So within a month, he died of horrible boils, and the modern doctors think it was probably some form of lupus, but it was an absolute agony. So that was the first part of the curse. Then the king, King Philip, within a week of Clement's death, had a horrible accident when he was riding. He didn't get killed, but he was lying in agony, and terrible agony. And while he was there, agonized, he had one consolation. He had 3 sons, and they were all heterosexual. They were all married, and that meant the line would continue, even though he was going to die. That's a big thing if you're a king. You want your line to continue. So before he died, he witnessed an awful scandal, probably one of the biggest sexual scandals in French history, where all three wives of the three heirs were caught in a sexual orgy in the Tour de Nesle. And it was a really awful thing, even for those days, even for royal people. So that really destroyed that. And then the king died in a shame and horror of this scandal. His eldest son took over the throne. He was dead within a month. The second son took over the throne. He was dead within a week or two. And the third son, all of them with no children, the third son died. That was the end of the line. That was the curse of Jacques de Molay. Anyway, I could go on for hours. It's a fascinating story. So that's Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And they've carried on making the wines ever since. Here are the, and that's our label, by the way. And you'll notice on all the labels and on many of the bottles, the Pope's, the symbol of the Pope, which are the crossed keys of St. Peter. Oh, the final thing before we leave this is, okay, that's why the popes were there, because of Pape Clement and Philippe IV. But once that political pressure had changed, the popes could have gone back to Rome. But they stayed there for over 100 years. And over 100 years later, the famous Italian poet Petrarch asked the Pope, why are you still here in Avignon? Why haven't you come back to the Holy See in Rome? And the Pope said, I can't remember which Pope it was, but he said, the wines, they are so wonderful here. So good to know that your popes are human and the wines are good. Here are the two most famous, particularly Vieux Télégraphe. It's probably the most well-known of all the top Châteauneuf-du-Papes. But you can see at $175, $81, we got a real bargain this evening. So I hope that cheers you up. And again, you'll see I've highlighted 1990, 1989. Those were the 2 years where throughout Europe, particularly France, the vintages were so great. The weather was just perfect. And those are regarded as ultimate classical vintages. Here, this is the backside, if you like, of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, of the chateau. Here is a list of the 18 grapes which are permitted. 9 red, 9 white. But again, I've highlighted the Grenache Mourvèdre de Syrah, the GSM. Those are the major grapes. And if you look at the back of your bottle, if you've got this particular one, they've actually spelt it out. What percentage of the GSM is in this particular bottle. And now, I better have a drink before I do this. I'm going to unmute you for a moment, and we'll see what happens. I hope I can unmute. Mute all. I'm going to allow participants to unmute themselves.
Hey, Patrick, can you hear me? This is Mary Lee.
Mary Lee, yes, I can hear you.
I have a question. When I lived in Paris, the common wine, in a restaurant, if you were just, get a little half carafe or something, was a Côte de Rhone.
Uh-huh.
And so I saw on your map that there's an area called Côte de Rhone.
Well,
any idea why its popularity as a basic brasserie wine?
This sounds bad, and I don't mean it that way. But the Côte de Rhone is the lowest classification, but that doesn't mean that in a negative way. In other words, as long as it's a GS, as long as it's got the approved grapes, then anywhere from, it's the only one that can be grown in the northern Rhone and the southern Rhone, and it is the most popular and the most widely. But to say, so you can get really, really good and expensive Côte de Rhone, and you can get cheap ones in Publix.
Right. It was like the basic carafe wine.
Yes.
And my neighbors, our building had, the caves, the storage, wine storage areas. And people would brag about, their Côte de Rhones. But of course, I understood that most of them are less expensive, but they'd buy the barrels, when they'd go to the south of France. So this has been delightful seeing
they bring
this
the barrels
Rhone area.
So do we like this?
Yes, this is delightful. Thank you for answering the question.
Okay. Anybody else got a question? We've got 20 minutes left.
Actually, my partner here, Coda, has a question. I think Dylan may have the same one. I've seen people give wine to their dogs. Do you know if they can have wine?
Why? Now, I've got to explain that Dylan has been banned this evening. He's not here.
I think I saw him in Jude's view.
No, he's with Jude. And some people thought it might be he might be distracting. So we can do I can do a popularity, if his fans want him back. The trouble is, there's a front door here looking over the street, and this is the time of day when people walk their dogs, particularly attractive female dogs. And when Dylan sees one of those, normally he's a very well-behaved person. He could be participating in this. He'd be sniffing at the wine. But if he sees a female dog going past, he goes crazy. So that's why he's banned this evening. So I'll leave it to popular request whether we bring him back. The other thing I should mention while I can see probably 12 of you, but Beatrice, Ian Ilyich, Bernadette, Pravan, Les I met at the museum just a few days ago, Simon, Gigi, Adriana, Connie, and Salita. I can't see any of you. I just see a blank thing with your name. There we go. Hey, some of you. Here we go. Now and can the rest of you? There we go. You can all wave at each other. And now I'm going to move us back to.
Patrick, can I ask a question quickly?
Yes.
Petite Syrah, does that mean anything? Like when you see something that's a Petite Syrah, does that mean?
I can't remember. I've come across that before. I think it's a Californian thing. I remember researching it for my book, and I might have got the answer in there, but I'm not gonna bore you by looking it up now. But I will respond by email, and that's the general thing. If I can't answer a question live, then I will do my research and send you an email or ask Dylan.
One quick question.
Yes.
From your list, I have us down for drinking an Anderson Valley Pinot Noir next week. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I was going to explain it next week. When I was picking the wines for this course, I was trying to keep the price down, and I felt a bit bad about last week. $54 on a Stag's Leap, but I thought, there was a reason behind that. So when it came to doing the Burgundies, and you'll understand a bit more next week, the prices of Burgundies, really, of a decent Burgundy, are pretty high. So, sorry, a proper French Burgundy. So that's why I decided to go with a Northern Californian or Oregon. It just so happened that I couldn't find an Oregon Pinot Noir the day I was shopping, so that's why we've got the Anderson Valley. But it's close to the border. But ideally, we would be drinking a Pouilly Foussé or next week. But we can talk about that next week. But that was a thought behind it all.
Patrick, I have a question about the Châteauneuf du Pape. We were not able to get the same bottle that you're tasting today. We got the Domaine de la Solitude from Family Lancôme.
I'm sorry.
We got a Domaine de la Solitude from
Instead of
Family Lancôme.
the chateau.
Yes. What is the variation? Are these different houses? What is, I mean, I remember being in Avignon years ago and going to a monastery and they had the Châteauneuf du Pape, and I don't understand the different variations.
No, they're just different vineyards. So in other words, let's simplify it and go back to, you know, Coral Gables is an AOC. Down on the south side near Granada golf course, there's more sun and the soil is such and such, and you know you have a vineyard there. Whereas up near 8th Street, well, so in other words, yes, you've got a Châteauneuf du Pape. It's from that. It's very tightly defined what the geographic area is, but within that you've got good soil, you've got bad soil, you've got a good farmer, you've got, you know, all those variations. So the number of different vineyards, and we'll see that a bit. We're going to move on now to Bordeaux, and next week when we really focus in on Burgundy, where what we're going to do now is Bordeaux, where you have big chateaus and big landowners. Next week in Burgundy, tiny little plots and enormous differences in taste between them all. So let me, that's the end of that. Now we're going to move on to Burgundy, sorry, Bordeaux. There we go. Okay, Bordeaux has quite a long history. Originally, and it's very much tied in with the English and the Dutch, with the export market, if you like. If you remember from last week, I gave you a map which showed that in Burgundy, they provided the wines for the court in Paris, the court in Dijon, the Pope down in Avignon. Whereas the Romans planted the original vineyards in Bordeaux to export wine to their centurions up in England and elsewhere. That's how it started. Then in 1152, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who owned, let me see if I can do this. She owned, I don't know if you can see where I'm going, Aquitaine. She married the guy who owned all of this. So they basically owned the whole east coast of France, and then he became Henry II of England. So he was King of England and King of a good third of France. So that's when the real relationship between the English and the wines of Bordeaux began. As I say, there in 1203, they had these fleets which went up twice a year, 300 more ships loaded with wine, with battleships, medieval battleships, following along to protect them from all the pirates. But vast quantities, nothing but wine, going up to England from Bordeaux. Then we've already mentioned Pape Clement was Archbishop of Bordeaux, and then became the Pope down in Avignon. The 100 Years' War actually went on longer than that. But it was all about the wine. The English, you know, they needed, the English don't grow any wine. Bordeaux was where they've been getting it from. And that's what the battle was all, that's what the war was all about, was keeping control of the supplies of wine. I've mentioned Haut-Brion in 1525. The reason being that the owner, and I can't remember his name now, the owner of Haut-Brion, before that, they would simply send, you've got your chateau here, you've got your vineyard there, you put it all together and you put it in the cask and you send it off to England, and it's Bordeaux wine. He was the first person to say, no, my chateau, this is special. We're going to I'm going to ship it separately. I'm going to bottle it. And consequently, it's early medieval marketing. So we've got records of Samuel Pepys, for example, saying, oh, this morning I had a very nice Haut-Brion. Charles II, King Charles II in England, his cellar book listed Haut-Brion as a specific wine from a specific vineyard. And very quickly, all the other major aristocrats in the area did the same thing. So Chateau Lafite, Chateau Latour started, but before Haut-Brion, nobody had done that. Then I've also mentioned there, 1787, Jefferson was the American ambassador to Paris. And just before the French Revolution, we have records of him going down to Haut-Brion and buying 6 cases of Haut-Brion, shipping them back to Paris, and then they vanish. So we don't know. There are all sorts of stories, and there's a wonderful book, I think I can send it to you. It's called The Billionaire's Vinegar. What happened to those 6 cases of Haut-Brion that Jefferson bought. And then, most significantly, in 1855, Emperor Napoleon III, realizing the importance of wine to the French economy, told the wine growers to classify their wines. So they divided their wines up based on past prices and market conditions for the previous 100 years into 5 different levels: first growth, second growth, third growth, fourth growth, fifth growth. They call growths. And as I think we discussed last week, despite 2 world wars, several revolutions, in life, nothing has changed. That classification has remained exactly the same, with one exception. And the one exception, as we discussed last week, was Philip the Rothschild and his Mouton de Rothschild, which went from, he got it from second growth up to first growth, and then 2 years later, some punk American Stag's Leap beat him in an international competition. So here are the main regions of Bordeaux. First of all, the regions of Médoc, which is the left bank of the Garonne, Grave, which is the southern part, south of and that's where the original vineyards were. So you can see there Haut-Brion and Chateau Pape Clément. And as I said, Pape Clément is having its 720th harvest even now as we speak, which is pretty amazing, I think. On the right bank, Libournaise, you have famous Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. But the most famous wines of Bordeaux, and when we think of the big names, they come from the Médoc. That's the area on the Garonne. And here are the big ones. Chateau Latour, Lafite, and Mouton Rothschild are all, oh, let me just go back just for a second. If you look down at the bottom right of the screen, it says Médoc, and Médoc is the district. Within the district, you have a number of communes, Saint-Estèphe, Pauliac, Saint-Julien, Haut-Médoc, Margaux. They are the appellations d'origine contrôlée. And then within those AOCs, you've got individual chateaus. For example, as I put there, Chateau Latour. So, and if you remember, I mentioned a very rich, filthy rich Frenchman, Francis Pinault, earlier, because he bought a monopole in the northern Rhone. He also owns Chateau Latour, which is pictured there. Chateau Haut-Brion, that's the one that is down south of Bordeaux. Cheval Blanc and Chateau Figeac are Saint-Emilion. Those are on the left, on the right bank. And Pomerol, probably one of the most expensive wines in the world, Chateau Petrus, and Chateau d'Yquem Well, that's not a red wine, it's a white wine, and I could go on for hours talking about Chateau d'Yquem. They are the most delightful, rich, intoxicating wines in the world. Here are the 5 first growths. There's Latour, Lafite, Mouton Rothschild, Margaux, and Haut-Brion. What's interesting is that during the 19th century, the English aristocracy tended to prefer Chateau Lafite. I'm not sure why. You know, these things, fashions just form themselves. But oddly enough, in the latter part of the 20th century, the Chinese aristocracy have also preferred Lafite. And of course, when you get and that jacked up the prices ridiculously. And when you get big prices, you get crime, you get fraud. So most of the people making fraudulent wine were doing it for Chateau Lafite. And the Chinese finally sort of wise to this. So now it's very interesting. The Chinese are preferring Chateau Haut-Brion. And you can see from the shape of the bottle, it's just that much more difficult to make a fraudulent bottle than a Lafite. Here are examples of the labels. These labels haven't changed for decades. It's always the Grand Vin, Chateau Latour, the picture of the you know, the rather rustic picture of Lafite. Haut-Brion has never changed. The one that does change all the time, of course, is Mouton Rothschild, because Philippe de Rothschild, Baron Philippe, got a different artist every year. This particular label there was Pablo Picasso. And if you want to buy that, just the label alone, I looked it up on eBay, $18 for a copy of the label. So you're probably all aware of people who can go, oh yes, yes, the south side of the River Garonne, and it was picked at 8 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, we all know people who pretend to do that, but how really, there are people who can identify wine. So what I'm going to do now is read an excerpt from part of this story, a short story called Taste by Roald Dahl, in which, well, here's the background. It's a dinner party, and the guest of honor is a wine connoisseur. And the host has got a bottle which the label is hidden, and they've got a bet going on. The bet is that the wine connoisseur, by tasting the wine, will be able to identify the vineyard that it came from. And the stakes are high. If the connoisseur loses, then he has to hand over the deeds to his chateau. But if he wins, he gets the daughter of the host. High stakes. I'll send you the full story after the end of the class. But the reason I'm doing this is that to explain the thought process when you're narrowing in to work out where a wine comes from. So now we quote. So here goes the connoisseur. So he's tasted it. Interesting little wine, very interesting, gentle and gracious, almost feminine in the aftertaste. First then, which district in Bordeaux does this wine come from? That's not too difficult to guess. It's far too light in the body to be from either Saint-Emilion or Grave. It's obviously a Medoc. And there we are, it's the Medoc. There's no doubt about that. Now, from which commune in Medoc does it come? That also, by elimination, should not be too difficult to decide. Margaux? No, it cannot be a Margaux. It has not the violet bouquet of a Margaux. Pauillac? It cannot be a Pauillac. Either it's too tender, it's too gentle and wistful for Pauillac. The wines of Pauillac have a character that is almost imperious in its taste. And also, to me, a Pauillac contains just a little pith, a curious, dusty, pithy flavor that the grape acquires from the soil of the district. No, no, this is a very gentle wine, demure and bashful in the first taste, emerging shyly but quite graciously in the second. A little arch perhaps in the second taste, and a little naughty also, teasing the tongue with a trace, just a trace of tannin. Then in the aftertaste, a delightful, consoling and feminine, with a certain blithely generous quality that one associates only with the wines of the commune of Saint-Julien. Unmistakably, this is a Saint-Julien. He leaned back in his chair, held his hands up level with his chest, and placed the fingertips carefully together. Now, let me see, where were we? Ah, yes, this wine is from Bordeaux, from the commune of Saint-Julien, in the district of Médoc. So far, so good. But now we come to a more difficult part, the name of the vineyard itself. For in Saint-Julien, there are many, many vineyards. And as our host so rightly remarked earlier on, there is often not much difference between the wine of one and the wine of another. But we shall see. He paused again, closing his eyes. I'm trying to establish the growth. Remember the 5 different growths, the classification? If I can do that, it'll be half the battle. Now let me see. This wine is obviously not from a first growth vineyard, not even a second. It's not a great wine. The quality, the what do you call it? The radiance, the power is lacking. But a third growth? That it could be. And yet I doubt it. We know it's a good year. Our host has said so. And this is probably flattering it a little bit. I must be careful. I must be very careful here. He picked up his glass and took another small sip. Forgive me while I do the same. Yes, he said, sucking his lips. I was right. It's a 4th growth. Now I'm sure of it. A 4th growth from a very good year. From a great year, in fact. And that's what made it taste for a moment like a 3rd or even a 2nd growth. Good. Now we're closing in. What are the 4th growth vineyards in the commune of Saint-Julien? Again, he paused, took up his glass and held the rim against the sagging, pendulous lower lip of his. Then I saw a tongue shoot out, pink and narrow, the tip of it dipping into the wine, withdrawing swiftly again, a repulsive sight. Only the lips. Then he lowered the glass, his eyes remained closed, his face concentrated, only the lips moving, sliding over each other like 2 pieces of wet, spongy rubber. There it is again, he cried. Tannin. Tannin in the middle taste, and a quick, astringent squeeze upon the tongue. Yes, yes, of course. Now I have it. The wine comes from one of those small vineyards around Bécherville. I remember now, the Bécherville district and the river and the little harbour that's silted up so the wine ships can no longer use it. Bécherville. Could it actually be Bécherville itself? No, I don't think so, but somewhere very close. Chateau Talbot. Could it be a Talbot? Yes, it could. Wait one moment. He sipped the wine again. No, I was wrong. It is not a Talbot. A Talbot comes forward to you just a little quicker than this one. The fruit is nearer the surface. So if it's a 1934, which I believe it is, then it couldn't be a Talbot. Let me think. It's not a Bécherville. It's not a Talbot, and yet it's so close to both of them. So close that the vineyard must be almost in between. Now, what could that be? He hesitated, and we waited, watching his face. Ah, he cried, I have it. Yes, I think I have it. For the last time, he sipped the wine, and then, still holding the glass and up near his mouth, he said, you know what this is? It's the little Chateau Brunet-Ducreux. And the year, 1934. We all looked at our host, waiting for him to turn the bottle around in its basket to show the label. Is that your final answer? He said. Yes, I think so. Well, is it or isn't it? There it is. That's the little vineyard. And there's the bottle. And I'm going to send you the rest of the story because I don't want to spoil it for you. It's well worth reading. But the reason I went through that this evening was to show you the thought process of a connoisseur as, let me stop that now. And this bottle, for example, I did find there's a local restaurant here, the Surf Club, which has it on the menu for $3.48 a bottle. So that's it for this evening. I'm sorry I went over time a little bit. Next week we're going to do the wines of Burgundy. Let me unmute you. No, you're all unmuted. Does anyone have any further questions?
Quick question, Patrick.
Yes.
How come these wines command those prices of $600, $700? Is it really the quality? Is it more scarcity? Is it they get famous?
We're really going to talk about that in class number 5. And you've seen, you know, I've shown you a few that we looked at a couple of bottles this evening, which are over $1,000 per bottle. And you imagine to yourself, you know, I mean, what can it, I can't imagine. I've never had $1,000 bottle to drink. But on class number 5 and class number 6, we're going to be talking bottles which are over 100,000 for a bottle. You know, we're talking about $6,000 for a tiny little sip. It's mind-blowing. I don't know what the answer is. I do know I have had, in my life, I've had expensive wines which were much more than what I normally drink, and I can understand why, you know, and it was worth it. Particularly when I was employed, and it was my my corporation that was paying for it. But I can't imagine something being worth. So to answer your question, yes, there's a certain amount of snobbery. There's a certain amount of showing off. That you know, there's a lot of that, I think, and then scarcity. So when we come to Burgundy next week, which is a much smaller area than Bordeaux, these fabulous wines are simply very, very rare. So people will pay that extra money to get put on the list. But
Patrick, hey, it's Jason. I have a question for you. And it goes to that kind of scarcity question. So how many bottles does like a Chateau Lafite or an Rhone or something like that, how many bottles a year do they produce?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know the answer in terms of numbers, but that's easy enough to Google. But the ones you quoted, Lafite, Latour, the big left bank chateaus from Bordeaux do produce vast amounts of, you know, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of cases, because they have a large area. Whereas in Burgundy, as we'll see next week, much smaller areas, and therefore the numbers are much smaller. So let's going back to Bordeaux, and we didn't have time to cover that this evening. What they have in Bordeaux is called en primeur. So there you are. You own Chateau Latour. You produced your, you know, again, I don't know the numbers, but 600,000 bottles for this year, but they're not going to be ready to drink decently for another 20 or 30 years. So they have a thing called en primeur, which is when places like Harvard and Oxford University and the Ritz Hotel in Paris and you know, the big institutions, they will go and they will taste the wine, this year's crop, and make a decision about buying it, and they'll get it at a fabulous discount, because otherwise you, as the owner of Chateau Latour or Chateau Margaux, you're going to have to sit on it for 30 years, vast amounts of money, until you can sell it. So what they're doing is selling it en primeur before it's even put in a bottle, because it's going to stay in the casks for another 5 or 6 years. I actually would love that job, because even if I make a totally lousy choice, I won't be around in 20 or 30 years when they discover the wine I bought was useless. But nobody's offered me the job, so I'm here. Any other questions before I send you off to? Oh, and the what I was going to do with the wine, except I still got enough. Jude and I are going to have it for dinner. I still think it's a little bit young. It's 2018. That's very young for a Chateau Neuf, really. So I'm probably going to decant it. So if any of you've got any left, now who's that drinking from the bottle? It's kidding. See you all next week. Thank you for